Hello everyone, you are just joining in a literary heaven, the literary nook by Fairy and his Fairy. Let's start our today's topic, but before going further, don't forget to subscribe my channel, like the videos and share. Today we'll discuss another important era of English literature, and that is the Puritan Age. The literature of the 17th century may be divided into two periods: the Puritan Age or the Age of Milton, which is further divided into Jacobean and Carolean periods after the names of the ruled James I and Charles I, who rules from 1603 to 1625 and then 1625 to 1649 respectively, and the Restoration period or the Age of the Dryden. The 17th century was marked by the decline of the Renaissance spirit, and the writers either imitated the great master of Elizabethan period or followed new paths. We no longer find great imaginative writers of the stature of Shakespeare, Spenser, and Sidney. There is a marked change in temperament which may be called essentially modern. Though during the Elizabethan period the new spirit of the Renaissance had broken away with the medieval times and started a new modern development. In fact, it was in the 17th century that this task of breaking away with the past was completely accomplished, and that the modern spirit, in the fullest sense of the term, came into being. And this spirit may be defined as the spirit of the observation and of the preoccupations with details and a systematic analysis of facts, feelings, and ideas. In other words, it was the spirit of science popularized by such great men as Newton, Bacon, and Descartes. In the field of literature, this spirit manifests itself in the form of criticism, which in England is the creation of 17th century. And during the 16th century, England expanded in all directions. In the 17th century, people took stock of what had been acquired. They also analyzed, classified, and systemized it. And for the first time, the writers began using the English language as a vehicle for storing and conveying facts. One very important and significant feature of this new spirit of observation and analysis was the popularization of art of biography, which was unknown during the 16th century. Thus, whereas we have no recorded information about the life of such an eminent dramatist as Shakespeare, in the 17th century, many authors like Fuller and Aubrey laboriously collected and chronicled the smallest facts about great men of their own day or of the immediate past. Autobiography also come in the wake of biography, and later on keeping of the diaries and writing of journals became popular. For example, Pepys diary and Fox journal. All these new literary developments were meant to meet the growing demand for the analysis of feeling and the intimate thoughts and sensations of real men and women. The 17th century up to 1660 was dominated by Puritanism, and it may be called the Puritan Age or the Age of Milton, who was the noblest representative of the Puritan spirit. Broadly speaking, the Puritan movement in literature may be considered as the second or the greater Renaissance, marked by the rebirth of the moral nature of men, which followed the intellectual awakening of Europe in the 15th and the 16th centuries. Though the Renaissance brought with it culture, it was mostly sensuous and pagan, and it needed some sort of moral sobriety and profundity, which were contributed by the Puritan movement. Moreover, during the Renaissance period, despotism was still the order of the day, and in politics and religions, and fanaticism were rampant. The Puritan movement stood for liberty of the people from the shackles of the despotic ruler, as well as the introduction of the morality and high ideals in politics. Thus, it had two objects: personal righteousness and civil and religious liberty. In other words, it aimed at making men honest and free. Though during the Restoration period, the Puritans began to be looked down upon as a narrow minded, gloomy dogmatist who were against all sorts of reactions and amusements. In fact, they were not so. Moreover, though they were profoundly religious, they didn't form a separate religious sect. It would be a grave travesty of the facts if we call Milton and Cromwell, who fought for liberty of the people against the tyrannical rule of Charles I, as a narrow minded fanatics. They were the real champions of liberty and stood for toleration. The name Puritan was at first given to those who advocated certain changes in the form of worship of the Reformed English Church under Elizabeth, as King Charles and his councillors, as well as some of the clergymen with Bishop Laud as their leader, were opposed to this movement. Puritanism in course of the time became a national movement against the tyrannical rule of king and stood for the liberty of the people. Of course, the extremists among Puritans were fanatics and stern. In the long protracted struggle against despotism made even the middle ones hard and narrow. So, when Charles I was defeated and beheaded in 1649, and Puritanism came out triumphant with the establishment of the Commonwealth under Cromwell, severe laws passed. Many simple modes of recreations and amusements were banned, and the austere standard of living was imposed on unwilling people. But when we criticize the Puritans for his restriction and simple and innocent pleasure of life, we should not forget that it was the same very Puritan who fought for the liberty and justice, and who, through self discipline and austere way of living, overthrew despotism and made the life and property of the people of England safe from the tyranny of rulers. In literature of the Puritan age, we find the same confusion as we find in religion and politics. The medieval standards of chivalry and the impossible loves and romances which we find in Spenser and Sidney have completely disappeared, as there were no fixed literary standards. Imitation of older poets and exaggeration of the poets replaced the original, dignified, and highly imaginative composition of the Elizabethan writers. The literary achievements of the so called gloomy age are not of the high order, but it had the honor of producing one solitary masters of verse whose work would shed luster on any age or people. John Milton, who was the noblest or indomitable representative of the Puritan spirit, to which he gave a most lofty and enduring expression. Puritan poetry, also called the Jacobean and Carolean poetry during the reign of James I and Charles I, respectively, can be divided into three parts. First one is poetry of the school of Spenser. Second one is the poetry of the metaphysical school, and the third one is the poetry of Cavalier poets. The Spenserians were the followers of Spenser, in spite of the changing conditions and the literary tastes which resulted in the reaction against the diffuse Italianate poetry, which Spenser and Sidney had made fashionable during the 16th century. They preferred to follow Spenser and considered him as their master. The most thoroughgoing disciples of the Spenser during the reign of the James I were Phineas Fletcher, Giles Fletcher. They were both priests and followers of Cambridge University, and Phineas Fletcher wrote a number of Spenserian pastorals and allegories. His most ambitious poem is The Purple Island, portrays in a minutely detailed allegory the physical and the mental constitution of man, the struggle between the temperance and his foes, the will of man and Saturn, though the poem follows the allegorical pattern of the fairy queen. Giles Fletcher was more lyrical and mystical than his brother, and also made a happier choice of the subjects: his Christ victory and triumph in heaven and earth over after death, which is an allegorical narrative description in a lyrical strain. And it is a link between the religious poetry and resurrection of the Christ. And there is a definite blend of Spenser and Milton. It is written in flamboyant, diffuse style of Spenser, but it is ethical in its aspect. Other poets who wrote under the influence of Spenser were William Browne, George Wither, and William Drummond. Browne's important poetical work is Britannia's Pastoral, which shows all the characteristics of Elizabethan pastoral poetry, and the same didactic tone and the lyrical strain are noticed in the poetry of George Wither. His best known poems are The Shepherd's Hunting. He writes in an easy and homely style, free from conceits. He often dwells on the charms of nature and consolation provided by the songs. Drummond, who was a Scottish poet, wrote a number of pastoral sonnets, songs, elegies, religious poems, and his poetry is the product of the school of refined nature, high imaginative faculty, and musical ear. The metaphysical poets were John Donne, Harry Thomas, Richard Corshaw, Henry Vaughan, George Herbert, Lord Herbert, and the leader of this school was Donne. They are called the metaphysical poets not because they are highly philosophical, but because their poetry is full of conceits, exaggerations, quibbling about the meaning of the words, display of learning, far-fetched similes and metaphors. It was Dr. Johnson who, in his essay on Abraham Cowley and his Lives of the Poets, used the term metaphysical poets. So, though Dr. Johnson was prejudiced against the metaphysical school of poets, and above the statement is full of exaggeration, one important feature of the metaphysical school, which Dr. Johnson mentioned, was their discovery of occult resemblance in things apparently unlike. So, however, Dr. Johnson didn't fall to notice that beneath the superficial novelty of the metaphysical poets in their fundamental originality. The metaphysical poets were honest, original thinkers. They tried to analyze their feelings and experiences, even the experience of love. They were also aware of the life, were concerned with death, burial, descent into hell. Though they hoped for immortality, they were obsessed by the consciousness of morality, which was often expressed in a mood of mawkish disgust. John Donne, the leader of the metaphysical school of poets, had a very checkered career until he became the dean of St. Paul. Though his main work was to deliver religious sermons, he wrote poetry of a high order. His best known works are The Progress of the Soul, An Anatomy of the World, An Elegy, and Epithalamion. His poetry can be divided into three parts. First one is amorous, second one is metaphysical, and the third one is satirical. In his amorous lyrics, which include his earliest work, he broke away from the patriarchal model so popular among the Elizabethan poets and expressed the experience of love in a realistic manner. His metaphysical and satirical works, which form a major portion of his poetry, were written in later years. The Progress of the Soul and Metamorphosis, in which Donne pursue the passages of the soul, though various transmigrations, including those of a bird and fish, is a fine illustration of the metaphysical poetry. A good illustration of his style is his fourth style, describing the character of a boar. They were written in a rhymed couplet and influenced both Dryden and Pope. Donne has often been compared to Browning on account of his metrical roughness, obscurity, and ardent imagination, taste for metaphysics, and unexpected divergence into a sweet and delightful music. Thus, with Donne, the Elizabethan poetry, with its mellifluousness and richly observant imagination, came to an end, and the Caroline poetry, with its harshness and deeply reflective imagination, began. Though Shakespeare and Spenser still exerted some influence on the poets, yet Donne's influence was more dominant. Whereas the metaphysical poets followed the lead of the Donne, the Cavalier poets followed Ben Jonson. Jonson followed the classical method in his poetry as in his drama. He followed the immediate Horace by writing like him stires, elegies, epistles, and complimentary verses. But though his verses possess classical dignity and good sense, it doesn't have its grace and ease. His lyrics and songs also differ from those of Shakespeare, whereas Shakespeare's songs are pastoral, popular, and artless. Johnson's are sophisticated, particularized, and have intellectual and emotional rationality. Like the metaphysical, the label cavalier is not correct because a cavalier means a royalist, one who fought on the side of the king during the Civil War. The followers of Ben Jonson were not all royalists, but this label, once used, has stuck to them. Moreover, there is not much difference between the Cavalier and the metaphysical poets. Some Cavalier poets like Cario, Suckling, and Lovelace were also disciples of John Donne, and even some typical poems of Donne and Ben Jonson are very much alike. These are therefore not two distinct schools, but they represent two groups of poets who followed the different masters, Donne and Ben Jonson. Poets of both the schools, of course, turned away from the long, old fashioned works of the Spenserians and concentrated their efforts on the short poems, lyrics dealing with the themes of love, woman, and love or fear of God. The Cavalier poets normally wrote about trivial subjects, while the metaphysical poets wrote generally about serious subjects. The important Cavalier poets were Herrick, Lovelace, Suckling, and Cario. Though they wrote generally in a lighter vanity, yet they could not completely escape the tremendous seriousness of Puritanism. Milton was the greatest poet of the Puritan age, and he stands head and shoulders above all his contemporaries. Though he completely identified himself with Puritanism, he possessed such a strong personality that he cannot be taken to represent anyone but himself. Paying just a tribute to the dominating personality of Milton, Wordsworth wrote the famous line, "This soul was like a star and developed apart." Though Milton praised Spenser, Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson as poets, he was different from them all. We do not find the exuberance of Spenser in his poetry. Unlike Shakespeare, Milton is superbly egoistic. In his verse, which is harmonious and musical, we find no trace of harshness of Ben Jonson. In all his poetry, Milton sings about himself and his own lofty soul, being a deeply religious man and also endowed with the artistic merit of a high degree. He combined in himself the spirit of Renaissance and the Reformation. In fact, no other English poet was so profoundly religious and so much an artist. Milton was a great scholar of classical as well as Herbio literature. He was also a child of the Renaissance and a great humanist. As an artist, he may be called the last Elizabethan. From his young days, he began to look upon poetry as a serious business of life and made up his mind to dedicate himself to it. And in course of time, with a poem which the world would not let die. Milton's early poetry is lyrical. Important poems of the early period are the Hymn on the Nativity, El Allegro, Pensero, Lycidas Comus, and the Hymn. Written when Milton was only 21, shows that his lyrical genius was already highly developed. The complimentary poems El Allegro and the Penseroso and are full of very pleasing description of the rural scenes and the creations in spring and autumn. So, the lyrical genius of Milton was at its height. Besides these poems, a few great sonnets were also been written by Milton, as when the assault was intended to the city. Also belong to Milton's early period, full of deeply felt emotions, and these sonnets are among the noblest in English language. They bridge the gulf between lyrical tone of the Milton's early poetry and the deeply moral and didactic tone of the later poetry. When the Civil War broke out in 1642, Milton threw himself heart and soul into the struggle against King Charles I. He devoted the best year of his life, when his political powers were at their peak, to the national movement. Finding himself unfit to fight as a soldier, he became the Latin secretary to the Cromwell. This work he continued to till 1649, when Charles I was defeated and Commonwealth was proclaimed under Cromwell. But when he returned to poetry to accomplish the ideal he had in his mind, Milton found himself completely blind. Moreover, after the death of Cromwell and coming to Charles II to the throne, Milton becomes friendless. His own wife and daughters turned against him, but undaunted by all these misfortunes, Milton girded up his loins and wrote his greatest poetical works, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonist. The subject matter of Paradise Lost, consisting of the casting out from heaven of the fallen angels, their planning of revenge in hell, Satan's flight, man's temptation and falls from grace, and the promise of redemption. Against this vast background, Milton projects his own philosophy of the purpose of human existence and attempts to justify the ways of God to men. On account of the richness and profusion of its imagery, description of the strange lands and sea, and use of strange geographical names, Paradise Lost is called the last great Elizabethan poem. After Shakespeare, the drama in England suffered a decline during the reign of James I and Charles I. The heights reached by Shakespeare couldn't be kept by the later dramatist, and drama in the hands of Beaumont and Fletcher and others became what may be called decadent. In other words, the real spirit of the Elizabethan drama disappeared, and the only outward show and trappings remained. So the sentiment took place of the character, eloquent and moving speeches, instead of being subservient to the revelation of the fine shades of the characters become important in themselves. Dreadful deeds were described not with a view to throwing light on the working of the human heart, as we done by the Shakespeare, but to produce the rhetorical effect on the audience. Moreover, instead of fortitude and the courage, the sterns and qualities which were held in high esteem by Elizabethan dramatists, resignation to fate expressed in the form of broken accents of pathos and woe. became the main characteristics of the hero, whereas Shakespeare and other Elizabethan dramatists took delight in action and emotions associated with it, and the Jacobean and Carolian dramatists gave expression to the passive suffering and lack of the mental and physical vigor. Moreover, whereas the Elizabethan dramatists were sometimes coarse and showed bad taste, the later dramatists were positively and deliberately indecent. Thus, in the hands of these dramatists of the inferior type, the romantic drama, which had achieved great heights during the Elizabethan period, suffered a terrible decline, and when the Puritans closed the theatre in 1642, it died a natural death. This period was rich in prose. The greatest prose writers were Bacon and Burton, Milton, Sir Thomas Browne, and Jeremy Taylor. English prose, which had been formed into a harmonious and pliable instrument by the Elizabethans, began to be used in various ways as narrative as well as vehicle for the philosophical speculations and scientific knowledge. For the first time, the great scholars began to write English rather than Latin. The greatest single influence which enriched the English prose was the authorized version of the Bible, English translation of the Bible, which was the result of the efforts of scholars who wrote in a forceful, simple, and pure Anglo Saxon tongue, avoiding all that was rough, foreign, and affected. So the Bible became the supreme example of the earlier English prose style, simple, plain, and natural, as it was ready and as it was read by the people in general, and its influence was all pervasive. Francis Bacon belongs both to Elizabethan and Jacobean period. Was a lawyer possessing great intellectual gift. He wrote, "No man ever cuffed or turned aside from him without a loss." As a prose writer, he is the master of the aphoristic style. He has the knack of compressing his wisdom in epigrams, which contains the quaintness of the rich experience of life in a most concentrated form. His style is clear, lucid, but terse. That is why one has to make an effort to understand his meanings. Readers has always to be alert because each sentence is packed with meaning. Bacon is best known for his essays, and besides essays, he wrote Henry, the first piece of the scientific history in English language. Robert Burton is known for The Anatomy of Melancholy, which is a book of its own type in English language. In it, he has analyzed human melancholy. Sir Thomas Browne belonged entirely to a different category. With him, the manner of the writing is more important than the substance. He is therefore the first deliberate stylist in English language and the forerunner of Charles Lamb and Stevenson. Other writers of his period who were like Browne, masters of rhetorical prose, were Milton, Jeremy Taylor, and the Clarendon. Most of the Milton prose writing are concerned with the questions of the issue between the Parliament and the King. Being the champion of freedom in every form, he wrote a forceful tract on the doctrine and the discipline of divorce, in which he strongly advocated the right to divorce. Opposed to Milton, the greatest writer in the parliamentary struggle was the Earl of Clarendon. His prose is stately, and he always writes with a bias which is rather offensive, as we find in the history of the rebellion and the civil wars in England. Jeremy Taylor, a bishop, made himself famous by his literary sermons on account of the gentle charm of his language, the richness of his images, and the profoundly human imagination. He is considered as one of the masters of English eloquence. Thus, during this period, we find the English prose developing into a grandiloquent and rich instrument capable of expressing all types of ideas, scientific, religious, philosophical, poetic, and personal. That was all for today. Stay connected for more literary videos. Me, Fairy, signing out from the Literary Nook by Fairy.